Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and I'm thrilled to be with you today for our virtual reading group. We are, as you know, in the midst of reading Hannah Arendt's work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. The first 4 chapters of which are all part of book 1 of The Origins, and that book is called Anti-Semitism. We've read the first 3 chapters in anti-Semitism. Today, we're doing the 4th, the Dreyfus affair. I should note that we did not meet last week because it was the 15th annual Hannah Arendt Center conference on friendship and politics, which was a great event and a great success and really exciting. And for those of you who were there or watched online, I hope you enjoyed it. But as a result, we haven't met for 2 weeks, and I should just note that we haven't thus spoken to each other since the attack on Israel on November 6th and 7th. October 6th and 7th, and obviously the Israeli response as well. As we have been talking about anti-Semitism, we've been talking about Arendt's reading of it in the 19th and 20th centuries, but also, of course, it has been present as a reality for us today. And as you see, the incredible rise of anti-Semitic attacks around the world and the incredible virulent justification of violence, you can't, I think, separate these ideas. And I just want to mention that and put it out there. We'll have to think about that as we discuss this text. And especially given what's going on in the world, I do ask people in the chat and speaking to be respectful and open. That doesn't mean you can't disagree, but it does mean that it is important that we respect each other and figure out ways to converse with each other that allow us to argue, agree, disagree, and yet still maintain respect for each other. So since we're in the last chapter of this book on anti-Semitism, just a quick recap of where we've been and what we've accomplished. One of the core ideas in Arendt's thinking about anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism is not the same thing as hatred of Jews, right? This is one of the most radical and important insights that she has, right? So if someone says you're an anti-Semite or that X is an anti-Semite, and they say, well, I like Jews or I have nothing against Jews, from her point of view, that actually is not so relevant. Anti-Semitism for her is not anti-Jewish. It's a secular ideology that emerges in the 19th century. Unknown, she says, before the 1870s, so late 19th century. And it's as an ideology, what defines it is that it attempts to argue that Jews are the source of the problems in the world. That it is because of the Jews that whatever ill one is worried about is inflicting itself upon us. This has very little to do with Jews, right? And she says most people who are anti-Semites rarely ever encounter a Jew or know a Jew. Or that's not a requirement at all. It's simply that Jews become the Jews become a stand-in for political arguments, or become an argument for political arguments, or a proof for political arguments. Not a scapegoat, right? Because she says it can't just be random. There's a reason. And she has argued that the rise of political anti-Semitism, which is the most dangerous type, chooses the Jew for a particular reason, which is that as each class in society comes in conflict with the state, they become anti-Semitic because the Jews have been associated with the state. And in chapter 2, on the rise of anti-Semitism in the nation state, she walks us through both how the Jews get associated with the nation state as these exceptional or privileged Jews who then bankroll the state or are the court Jews, and how then the rise of anti-Semitic parties, whether it's left anti-Semitism or aristocratic anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism, all of them emerge insofar as they have a political claim against the state, and they see the Jews in their association with the state as an appropriate and easy target to magnify their political claims. This political anti-Semitism, she says, is different from social anti-Semitism, discrimination and prejudice. And while she says discrimination and prejudice and social anti-Semitism are in the end not as dangerous as political anti-Semitism, it is nevertheless the case, she says on page 87, that political anti-Semitism depends upon the idea of the Jew in general, that is a product of social discrimination and thus social anti-Semitism. So even though what's really dangerous is political anti-Semitism, it doesn't mean we shouldn't worry about social anti-Semitism, because it makes political anti-Semitism possible. This brings us to the last chapter of her book on anti-Semitism, which is on the Dreyfus affair, chapter 4. The Dreyfus affair, is, as I don't know how many of you know it, but she starts with the facts of the case, and it's worth at least rehearsing some of the facts as she presents it. So Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish officer, and by the way, the first Jewish officer of the French general staff in the military, was accused and convicted in 1894 of espionage for Germany, and he was sentenced to lifelong deportation to Devil's Island. In 1895, so the next year, a Colonel Picard, who is one of the heroes of the story, along with Clemenceau, was made head of the information division of the general staff of the military in France. And in the next year, 1896, he became convinced of Dreyfus's innocence. This is 2 years after his trial and conviction and sentence. He begins to argue for that innocence, at which point he is removed from his post and posted to a dangerous position in Tunisia. And this is when the fight to overturn the conviction begins. Bernard Lazare, a well-known Jewish writer, publishes the first pamphlet in favor of Dreyfus, arguing that he's innocent. Clemenceau, who will later become the prime minister of France, begins to fight for a re-examination of the case in 1897. In 1898, the famous pamphlet J'accuse by Zola, Émile Zola, is published. And that is when a man named Major Walzen Esterhazy admits to a British journalist that it was actually him who provided the materials to the Germans, and that another person, Colonel Henry, is the one who made the forgery, and Colonel Henry confesses. This is 4 years after, this is 4 years after the original trial. In 1899, a court of appeal annulled the sentence of Dreyfus, but then resentenced him to 10 years imprisonment anyway, at which point he was pardoned by the French president, Émile Loubet. 7 years after that, when Clemenceau becomes prime minister, he seeks to actually get Dreyfus acquitted fully, not just pardoned. He fails. It never happens. And Arendt goes through and tells a bit of the story of the continuing anti-Semitism around the Dreyfus case. In fact, in 1908, Dreyfus is attacked on the street in Paris, and when his assailant is put on trial, the court refuses to convict him and says that it does not believe that he was innocent that Dreyfus was innocent of treason, and refuses therefore to punish the person who attacked him on the street. That's just some basic background and facts. It's good to have it out there. Arendt obviously knew about the Dreyfus case. She was born in 1906, so a bit afterwards, but it was a case that was widely known in Europe. But she really begins to research it starting in 1933, when she, after she's arrested in Germany, and then flees Germany and goes to Paris, where she arrives in 1933 as a stateless refugee. She primarily then works for Jewish organizations. So she worked for an organization training Jewish colonists for settlement in Palestine. She actually was a secretary for Germaine de Rothschild and helped with her philanthropy. It's interesting that that's where Arendt's distaste for Jewish philanthropy was born. She also worked with a group called the Youth Aliyah, which was a major Zionist organization that brought children to Palestine. And she did go on a trip, taking as a chaperone children to Palestine in 1935, and returned to Paris really pretty taken with the Jewish world in Palestine, although she would not have wanted to live there. In 1938, she started working again on her book Rahel Varnhagen about the Jewish German who first assimilated, denied her Judaism, and then on her deathbed recanted and came back to being a Jew. And she turns and she becomes very much opposed to assimilation. And it's questionable whether how much of a Zionist she was. She worked for Zionist organizations. She brought people to Palestine. She herself didn't want to go, but she clearly was caught up in the Zionist critique of assimilation. It's at this time that she begins researching the Dreyfus affair. You can imagine why. She's living through the birth of National Socialism, and she's interested in this question of what is the relation between the Dreyfus affair, this outburst of virulent anti-Semitism in France in the late 19th century, the 1890s, and Nazi or German anti-Semitism as it emerges in the 1920s and 30s. In 1942, right after she comes to the United States in 1940, and in 1942, she's still learning English. She teaches a summer course at Brooklyn College, and the course is on the Dreyfus affair. And in that course, she makes two major points. First, that the role of the intellectual in politics often is to pander to the mob. That she's interested in the connection. She said, so the mob, right, which is a technical term in her work, and we're going to have as we go through this book, we're going to read a lot about the mob, which she's going to distinguish from the masses. And so it's going to be important for us to look at that distinction. But the mob is a power-hungry group of people who want power, but they're often the lower classes. But in her view, the mob can only be effective when they're in alliance with the elite or the intellectuals. And it's the intellectuals who defend and justify what the mob does. And so one aspect of the Dreyfus affair is that you saw the intellectuals and the mob joining forces. And so she's interested in that aspect of it. She also saw in the Dreyfus affair what she called in that lecture a new form of inhumanity and a particular coldness that she sees as potentially a precursor to fascism and totalitarianism. She argues that the Dreyfus affair was a huge dress rehearsal for a performance that had to be put off for more than 3 decades, namely Nazism. She calls it in the origins of totalitarianism a foregleam of future anti-Semitism and totalitarianism. And yet, she doesn't think that what happened in the Dreyfus affair is really the precursor to Nazism. And so in chapter 2, which we read a couple of weeks ago, when she describes the different early forms of anti-Semitism, she talks pretty extensively about French anti-Semitism. And this begins on page 45 in the Origins, in the text we're reading. And in this discussion of French anti-Semitism, she says, quote, "The Dreyfus affair brings into the open all other elements of 19th century anti-Semitism in its mere ideological and political aspects. It is the culmination of the anti-Semitism which grew out of the special conditions of the nation state." So the Dreyfus affair brings into the open 19th century anti-Semitism. You have to note that, not 20th century. She says its violent form, she continues, of French anti-Semitism foreshadowed future developments, so that the main actors of the affair sometimes seem to be staging a huge dress rehearsal for a performance that had been put off for more than 3 decades.
Bravo. High five.
She says that it drew together all the open or subterranean. Can you mute yourself, whoever's talking? It drew together all the open or subterranean political or social sources which had brought the Jewish question into a predominant position in the 19th century. And here's the key. She says French anti-Semitism, quote, stayed within the framework of a typical 19th century ideology. Namely, it didn't become international. It didn't become supranational. It was ultimately connected to the nation state, not to the death of the nation state, not to the rise of imperialism and thus totalitarianism. And thus she can say, antiquated as it was, French anti-Semitism had no influence on Nazi anti-Semitism. It is more significant in itself than as an active historical factor in the final catastrophe. And she goes on and says that the main reasons for what she calls, in a typically understated Arendtianism, the wholesome limitations of French anti-Semitism, right, is that it is nationalist, not internationalist, right? That they did not seek to organize a party above parties or to seize the state as a party for no other purpose than the party interest. They weren't simply brutally after power to achieve more power, to achieve more power, to achieve more power in a completely unlimited sense, which is what she thinks totalitarianism and thus totalitarian anti-Semitism aimed at. So she wants to make this distinction, but even if it is limited in a wholesome way, this early French anti-Semitism, she says, was, quote, the earliest instance of the success of anti-Semitism as a catalytic agent for all other political issues. And so she looks at it as a foregleam, as a model of the different ways that anti-Semitism will impact the world in the 20th century. The two ways in which she says it is this foregleam for later anti-Semitisms is one that it is clearly embraces the idea of the Jew, this idea of social anti-Semitism, and thus discrimination and hatred, not of particular Jews, but of this idea of the Jew. And secondly, that it is born of a suspicion of the state, of parliament, and the republic itself, and thus has a political sense in which the Jews and the hatred of Jews in general are used in a political way to attack the state and parliament and the French Republic. She develops this in the second and third parts of this chapter. The second part is on the Third Republic and French Jewry, which starts on page 95 and is largely about the Panama scandal, which I assume some of you don't know what it is, since I certainly didn't when I first read this book. But it was basically a huge scandal by someone who de Lesseps and his company, in which they were trying to build and did build the Panama Canal, but went bankrupt, and millions of French middle-class people lost their investments. The corrupt people involved were the Lesseps company and Parliament, none of whom were Jews, but the middlemen between them, who often allowed this to happen, some of them were Jews. But in any case, from Arendt's point of view, it was this Panama scandal which showed the corruption of Parliament and corruption of the French Republic, gets played up by the anti-Semitic press as a Jewish problem, even though Jews were not the main actors. And that's the first step here in her account. In the third chapter on the army and the clergy, again, you see an attack on the Republic, so that the army, which is a caste system, is an entity outside the nation, and the church was also seen as an escape from the chaos of the Republic. And so here she says, what you see is these two institutions are both set themselves against the Parliament, against the Republic, against the political class, in a way that allows them to attack the Republic through anti-Semitism. The key part of this chapter is section 4, which is called "The People and the Mob." This is where Arendt really develops some of the ideas which are going to come back in the book, especially in the chapter on the alliance between the elite and the mob later in the book, in the totalitarianism section. And when we get to that, you're going to want to come back and look at this. But the point here and the argument she's making is that there is a fundamental common error that people have in thinking about anti-Semitism and racist political movements. And the error is to see the mob as identical with the people instead of as a caricature of the people. This is on 106 to 107. The mob is not the people. The mob is a group that has simplified certain ideas and is mobilized as a caricature of the people for political ends of power. Who mobilizes the mob? It's the elite. You need a demagogue. You need a leader or a group of leaders. And so she says a number of things about the mob here, which will be important for us in understanding her later in the section on totalitarianism, where she comes back to this concept and wants to distinguish the mob from the masses. And by the way, I should say, I think, she wrote this book over many years. She uses the mob and the masses sometimes in opposition to each other, and sometimes she collapses them. And so here she's defining the mob in a way that's actually not distinguished from how she will define the masses also. So just keep that in mind. But the mob, she says, is first of all the residue of all classes, which is how she will describe the masses later in the book. But what she means by that is the mob is not the working class or the bourgeoisie or the elite. It's the people who sort of fall out of all of them. It's the people who don't belong in any of them. And the reason is the mob doesn't really have its own economic or class interest. What it wants is destruction and power. And it's the people who sort of fall out of the politics of interest and get mobilized in this nihilistic pursuit of power. They clamor then for a strong man, a great leader, and thus they prefer a plebiscite as a way of electing a leader. The mob hates society from which it is excluded, and they hate parliament where it is not represented, because the parliaments are the elitists. And the mob, thus, she here distinguishes from the people who fight for true representation, namely representation by the elite, who want to be spoken for, in their best sense. She says on page 107 that the high society and politicians of the Third Republic had produced the French mob in a series of scandals and public frauds. So, insofar as the military, the clergy, and high society and the politicians created the Panama scandal, attacked the parliament, attacked the republic, they made people see the republic as corrupt, and the mob then emerged as a group claiming and clamoring for power. But she says they could only do this with the help of the intellectuals. That she says the intellectuals in society protect the mob verbally. It's the mob who storms the shops and attacks the Jews in the street. It's the mob that hates society. But it's the intellectuals who justify it and explain why the Jews deserve to be tortured. And they tear off and they say, look, we talk about equal rights, but we don't really believe it. It's hypocritical. Let's be honest. Let's be authentic, and let's pursue our true power. She says on page 108, talking about the mob and the Jews, she says, excluded as it is from society and political representation, the mob turns of necessity to extra parliamentary action, right? So the mob is excluded. They're the refuse of society. They're the people who don't usually get to elect people into parliament. And so they turn to extra parliamentary action. Moreover, this mob, she says, is inclined to seek the real forces of political life in those movements and influences which are hidden from view and work behind the scenes. They believe that there's, Jews behind the scenes, running the show. They think, oh, we don't have access to power. It must be because some secret people do. She says that there can be no doubt that during the 19th century, Jewry fell into this category, as did Freemasonry and the Jesuits, these people who were seen to be behind the scenes, conspiracies. It is, of course, utterly untrue that any of these groups really constituted a secret society bent on dominating the world by means of a giant conspiracy. Nevertheless, it is true that their influence, however overt it may have been, was exerted beyond the formal realm of politics, operating on a large scale in lobbies, lodges, and confessional. So the argument is that they didn't have a giant conspiracy, but they weren't part of the politics, the mainstream politics. They weren't in parliament. And so to the extent they had power, it was as lobbies, as bankers, as lodges, as confessionals. And so she says the mob emerged here along with nationalist leaders. A lot of these nationalist leaders were in the army and in the journalist press corps. She talks about the nihilism of these nationalists who offered a philosophy of pessimism. This is on 112. And they had a delight in the doom that was the first sign of the imminent collapse of the European intelligentsia. Now, again, we'll come back to this much later in the book in the section on totalitarianism. But Arendt thinks that the intellectual elite came to be nihilists, came to believe that the world was so corrupt and politics was so corrupt and capitalism was so corrupt and the morals of society, bourgeois morals, were so corrupt that they had to be flushed down the toilet. And the only way to flush all of the institutional structures of society down the toilet was by destroying the society. And so she says the intellectuals, out of a sort of moral repugnance at bourgeois capitalist society, come to support the mob as their shock troops to tear society down. And what she says is, in France, it worked for 10 or 12 years during this Dreyfus affair, but it didn't have greater ambitions. All they wanted to do was have the army and the clergy run things. They didn't actually seek to spread this idea around Europe or around the world. It wasn't totalitarian. It was still preserving a kind of aristocratic, elitist nationalism that the elites sought to hold on to. What protected France in the end from these elite and from the elite and mob were a few people. One was Picard, the officer who she says was an aristocrat but not ambitious and had not yet embraced the idea of power and ends justify the means, who she says was utterly divorced from social clannishness on page 109, who simply stood up and tried to do what is right for his country. You might think of him as a good civil servant who, like a couple did 4 years ago, became whistleblowers and testified against the corruption of the political class. And it was Picard's sense of duty and sense of honor in doing what is right that allowed him to, once he became convinced of Dreyfus's innocence, pursue the matter even after he gets fired and reassigned to Tunisia. And the other hero of the story, it's interesting enough that she doesn't have great respect for Dreyfus. She thinks of Dreyfus as a parvenu, She thinks of his family as largely not willing to fight for him as much as they should have. She doesn't have a whole lot of respect for Dreyfus. She thinks the hero of the story is not Dreyfus, it's Clemenceau, who eventually becomes the prime minister of France. And when he does, is the one who fights for the pardon, not the pardon, but the acquittal, and fails in it, but fights for it. And what she thinks is so great about Clemenceau is that his fight for Dreyfus was not a fight against a particular misconduct of justice. She wasn't fighting for Dreyfus for Dreyfus. He was fighting for Dreyfus based on abstract ideas such as justice, liberty, and civic virtue. He was convinced, and he eventually convinced others, she says, that the infringements of the rights of one man was an infringement of the rights of all. And that was the way that the nationalist anti-Semitism of France was defeated, or at least countered, through certain individuals who embraced the idea of equality and justice, and actually created a movement, a mass movement, a mob movement to support them. She closes the chapter saying that what the Dreyfus affair shows us and teaches us is that it was the only episode of the 19th century in which we got a glimpse of what she calls the subterranean forces, the deep, dark, hateful, anti-Semitic forces that will come back in the 20th century in a very different form in totalitarianism. That's the first importance of it. The second is that it was the Dreyfus affair more than anything else in Europe that gave birth to the Zionist movement. And she says at the end of this chapter on 120, Zionism is the only political answer the Jews have ever found to anti-Semitism. The only political answer, right? If you're going to be attacked as Jews politically, in the end, she says, what the only answer the Jews could ever come up with was to leave and form their own country. So the Dreyfus affair is important for these two reasons. One is the foregleam of Nazism, and two, it's the birth of a political response to anti-Semitism, namely Zionism. Okay, let me stop there and remind us that there's two ways to engage in this discussion. One is through the chat, where I do ask you to be civil, and also by raising your hand. And so we will begin. Rachel.
Hi. I really enjoyed this chapter, and I've read it a couple times, and I feel a little bit lost since so many things are thrown around. But one thing that stuck out to me is how much there's conspiracy theory and intrigue going on in this kind of soap opera of politics, which seems very familiar today. But when I try to think through how it's important to as a moral exhortation to the present, um, it seems to me that I think, as I understood you were describing it, that the Third Republic had become very corrupt, and that the real tragedy lie in the fact that there wasn't enough citizens who were arguing and defending the rights of all as equality under the law. And everybody kind of showed themselves to be kind of a scoundrel because they were, arguing about things, how to advance their particular cause, but not sticking to the thing that is most important for democracy or republic to work, and that you defend the rights even of your opponents. And Clemenceau was a hero, and Bernard Lazare, I think, too, for sticking fast to this principle of equality under the law, which the nation state should protect. And so, if I feel there's perhaps a slight exhortation for us in our time to think about whether or not we have our own ideological opponents who are vilified, and we are not defending their rights, but where we take glory, or where we just want to win, so we don't care if, say, the Trump supporters or the working class are vilified or characterized as a threat to democracy, or characterized by the FBI as potential extremists. That we've lost the importance of protecting constitutional rights above all, and our fellow citizens, even if they are ideologically opposed to us.
Yeah, thank you. I think you've done a great job. I could go home, Rachel. Uh, everything you said, I think, is right. Um, there are clearly analogs to today, in the kind of situation she's describing. The corruption of politics and the political sphere, right? The idea that you pursue power at all costs, power begets power, and that lying or changing the rules is fine as long as it works. The end justifies the means. And we see this in our political and cultural realm. And we see an elite class that is willing to inflame and justify the power pursuit of the mob, because they think that the powers that be are no better. And they are willing to tear down the country or the institutions, right? I mean, those who want to say, let's tear down the Supreme Court because it's not, doing what we want, and it's really just politics. And so let's pack the court, or let's get rid of the court. Or on the other side, let's tear down the civil service because they're not really having the public interest at heart. They're elites, and they're stopping democracy, and they're stopping us from getting what we want done. And so you see, a right-wing attack on government and a left-wing attack on government in both those instances. And elites on both sides come to justify and support the mob, saying, look, you might think the mob are just power-hungry people, but, well, the people they're attacking are just power-hungry people, because there's no truth, there's no justice. All there is power, right? Read your Foucault. And if that's the case, why prefer one to the other? Let's watch the whole thing burn down. And I think that's the attitude of many elites on both the left and the right, I would say, today. A kind of joyful nihilism, or a kind of purely engaged power politics in which they simply become part of the mob themselves. And so, all of that said, you rightly, Rachel, say that she holds out as the antidote to that something that many people today, many elites today, and many mob people in the mob today find quaint, right? A kind of abstract belief in constitutionalism, in laws and procedures, and ideals that she thinks saved the French Republic from the mob, but it took 12 years and actually never fully saved it, because Dreyfus was never actually ever acquitted. And so you see this would be the critique that people would make. Well, see, justice and ideals don't work. He never got acquitted. And you can make that case, and then you can say it's all about power. But yes, I think you're right to say she holds up this idea of a constitutional republicanism as the antidote to nihilism and power. This will become a theme in the book. It's also a huge theme of her book on revolution, which we've read before and we'll read again at some point. For those interested, the Arendt Center just announced a conference we're going to have in March on this theme of power and authority around the Constitution and the court. And there's a call for papers that just went up last week. So if you're interested in this topic, we'd love to see you. But thank you, Rachel. It was a great question. Do you have a follow-up? I mean, it was a good question. I'll give you a follow-up, or is that good?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you. Jerry.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Jerry.
Hi. Roger, some of what you said made me wonder why this chapter is in the book at all, why this part of the book is in this book. Isn't it important for Hannah that she is showing the world, the shape of the world in the Dreyfus, excuse me, the character of the world in the Dreyfus in France at the time of the Dreyfus affair as a precursor to what is going to follow. You're right to say it isn't the same, but what is similar is the condition of alienation, a world alienation, not in the Marxist sense, but in the sense that she will later develop world alienation. And it seems to me that this chapter, at least I've always read it that way, is pinpointing that, in which you have masses who are alienated, within which you have a mob that is enraged. And it is that mob, the enraged mob, that some find we have echoes here today, but there certainly, it was the basis of Nazi Germany that sought one leader, needed one leader, which is what they got.
Yeah.
And that led to what Arendt calls, I don't think anybody ever said this before, the complete abandonment of politics. She coins the word Entpolitisierung. She uses that word in German, the abandonment of politics. And I think that's what she saw as a precursor of that in the Dreyfus affair. You are right, very goodness knows, absolutely right to say that she is no fan of Captain Dreyfus himself. By the way, I don't think it is that he was never pardoned. The point, I think, not that he wasn't excused, but he was never officially pardoned by the government. I'm not sure what the word was you used, but you said he wasn't vindicated. I think he was in a sense vindicated. He was never pardoned. And that is a huge distinction, I believe.
I think, well, just on that last point, Jerry, again, I'm not an expert on this period, but I'm just read the Arendt, and I also read another piece on it just to brush up on my history a little bit. My understanding was that in 1890, I think it's 1896, he was pardoned, but still then only pardoned. So he was only pardoned for the sentence, not for the crime. So that's the distinction.
Well, I think Arendt means that he was not pardoned by the state, for he was vindicated. He didn't have to go to any more punishment, anything like that. But he was not ever officially pardoned for the crime that his state accused him of. So I think that's just, I'm agreeing with you there, yeah. Roger. One other thing, I just wanted to add one thing, and that is this business about Zionism being the only answer that Jews came up with. That's the question I want to ask you. How do you think Arendt intends that? Do you think that she is then, because she did in a way become a Zionist in a very modified way, I believe, but do you think that's an encomium for Zionism? I never quite read it that way. I read it the other way, that it's the only, not in the unique sense, but there never was another way that they found. Anyway,
that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought of it that way. I do read it as an encomium at that point, and you know, obviously, but about I mean, she's writing. I mean, this obviously comes out in 1950, but she writes these chapters quite earlier. I you know, to what extent Arendt ever was a full-on Zionist is a hard question to answer, and I think she gives differing answers to that at different parts of her life. But you know, at the time she was interested in the Dreyfus affair, she had developed an argument which she articulates in chapter 2 of Origins, that the Jews never had a political response to anti-Semitism. They were, you know, they sought privileges, but they didn't politicize, they didn't act. And I think she comes to believe at this point, you know, she goes to the World Zionist Congress, she's working for the Zionist organizations. I think she comes to think that the only political response in which we Jews get together and act collectively to assert their collective interests is Zionism. You know, clearly she turns away from that, at least in some sense, in about 8 or 10 years. But I think she believes it at the time, but I'm not 100% sure. For your, you know, the other point you're making about the complete abandonment of politics and the turn to one leader, I think is right. I mean, I tried what I was hoping to say, and I hope this came through, and you can tell me if it did, is that on the one hand, she's interested in, and the reason this chapter is in the book is because it is a foregleam of what comes next. And it is insofar for 2 reasons. One is it provides this idea of the Jew, the social discrimination of the Jew, and 2, this political attack on Jews, based in this kind of complete abandonment. She says, though, you know, in the end, it was limited. I do love this phrase she uses, wholesome limitation of French anti-Semitism, is that it's nationalist and not internationalist, right? You know, and that's something to think about today, right? You know, people are really interested in these illiberal democratic movements that are arising around the world, whether it's in Russia or Hungary or China or in the US or in France or in Germany. And one of the questions that I think you have to ask is, are these closer to what we would call French racist or French nationalist movements, which have wholesome limitations, or are they more internationalist and thus dangerous in a totalitarian sense? And that's one of the reasons I emphasize that distinction, because I think that's an important question for anyone looking at the current zeitgeist to ask themselves. Thank you, Jerry. Vivian.
I have a minor footnote that may be of interest to some. The journalist who published the interview in the papers that exposed that with the confession, Esterhazy, was a woman, Rachel Sassoon-Bear, who was a rebel in her youth and a convert in the event, married a convert who owned newspapers. She was editor of the Sunday Times and the Observer in her day. So I mention that just as a note. I would say that the political climate in France during the 19th century is very complex and very deeply riven, very deeply scarred and divided. After the French Revolution of 1789, of course, with the empire, the first revolution that claimed, based on abstract justice, the revolution of 1848 collapsed into the Second Empire. The Second Empire collapsed with the Franco-Prussian War, at which Alsace-Lorraine, Dreyfus's home territory, was a sharply contested nationalist thing. And the big event of 1870-71, in which Proust, a time when Proust was born, ended with the French army coming into Paris and surrounding it so that it would give in to Germany. And it's at that time that the Internationale was written by communards in Paris who were eating rats and other things to hold out. So there was even some talk when the French Revolution, when the Third Republic was established, of a representative of the royal family, Henri V it would have been, coming in and reestablishing the monarchy. This was a pipe dream, but it was real for some people. So Arendt will know this. She will know it. But she's working through, it seems to me, a kind of argument that she wants to make by not going through all this, which I would be hard put to do in the number of pages she is doing. And certainly I know I am late to the party of the Arendt Center, and you may have discussed all this already, but it is a highly fraught political situation that this social anti-Semitism is keying into. And I want to let others speak, but I wanted just for that to be there. And when she does her imperialism section of this volume, she talks about the particularity of France in a much more detailed way, but she will know it writing this. Thank you.
Thank you. So Vivian, you're way beyond my
I know.
here,
I know.
and
I don't mean I know.
I'll simply say I I hear your points, and you know, I hope they will illuminate me and others, but I can't really
They
answer to them. Thank you.
book two.
Appreciate it. Peter.
Hi, thanks, Roger. I do appreciate the comments made here by Arendt and see its value going forward on describing the mob. I'm just wondering, and this may be simplistic, that I think the mob, the way I'd like to characterize them a little bit is that they were men, not only men, but probably more men than otherwise. They were Christian and they were true French people. Which would not be similar to what might have been seen as a description of Jews in France at that time, and certainly not of those Jews coming from Eastern European countries fleeing pogroms. And so I'm wondering how much one has to take into account, especially since I'm going to question this later in my comment. I'll try to be fast here. That they had choices. They had choices being, in effect, a true French person that many Jews didn't have. And I don't find that being distinguished here, especially since Arendt eventually, and I think as a result, they were disgruntled. They felt either they were unsuccessful or felt unsuccessful, and that creates a sense of frustrated disgruntlement, and you want to know why, and it's easier to change other people than to change yourself. So mob becomes one solution for some group of that people. She doesn't seem to question their choices, yet Jews, it feels like Arendt is saying, are making bad choices here. She doesn't say it explicitly. She says something like this on one page, the only shows, and again, you get an implication that she's at least judging them. The only shows how deeply most Jews were rooted in a society which was attempting to eliminate them. In retrospect, sure, I can agree with that. And I feel the same for those who stayed in Germany. As opposed to what other choice, though? Even what other choice if they were to assimilate? I don't think there's enough account of how much more limited oppressed people, and in this case, Jews, even if given a window of opportunity, have so much fewer choices, so many fewer choices, and yet could be blamed for not taking the choice of denying who you assimilating is the one way in which you can join the society. And you know that it's a joining at the license of the greater society, as opposed to what? Where else would they go? Here was at least better than nothing in France. And yes, they looked down their nose probably at Eastern European Jews who were saying that's what Jews are, and they didn't want to be seen that way. But I just think it's an unfair characterization. It's also disturbing that she always keeps using the word the Jews, but qualifies Catholics as the Catholic Church, Catholic clergy, Catholic bourgeoisie, all in this chapter. And at one point, in quotes, Catholics. I never see quotes around Jews. So it is a strange asymmetry in the way she's dealing with the mob versus Jews, how they make choices, and how she describes the Jews when it's truly, and granted, there were a good number of Jewish bankers in Paris, but most of that 100,000 or so French Jews at this time are not bankers, and they're not making choices. They're not court Jews. They're trying to live.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a fair point, I think. On page 117, which is section 5 of this chapter, which I didn't talk about very much. She has a short chapter called "The Jews and the Dreyfusards," right? And you know, she begins by the case of the unfortunate Captain Dreyfus had shown the world that in every Jewish nobleman and multimillionaire there still remains something of the old time pariah. So on the one hand, you know, even no matter how much you assimilate, you're still a pariah. And so she acknowledges that. At the bottom of the page, she says, when the Dreyfus affair broke out, to warn them that their security was menaced, right? That all Jews, I think a lot of Jews are feeling this right now, right? People who, for whatever reason, thought that their security was pretty secure. I think around the world, what you're seeing are Jews waking up in the last 10 days to this idea that that's not the case. And that's what the Dreyfus affair was, in a sense, for European Jews, even assimilated European Jews at the end of the 19th century. And so she says, when the Dreyfus, I mean, you could even see what's going on now is our Dreyfus affair if you want to try and find a parallel. When the Dreyfus affair broke out to warn them that their security was menaced, they were deep in the process of a disintegrating assimilation through which their lack of political wisdom was intensified rather than otherwise. Right? They didn't gain political wisdom. They were intensified in their lack of political wisdom. They were rapidly assimilating themselves to those elements of society in which all political passions are smothered beneath the dead weight of social snobbery, big business, and hitherto unknown opportunities for profit. So they were becoming parvenus. They hoped to get rid of the antipathy which this tendency had called forth by diverting it against their poor and yet unassimilated immigrant brethren, the Ostjuden. So they then separated themselves from the poorer Jews. And thus, she says, political anti-Semitism, as it had manifested itself in the pogroms of Russia and Romania, they dismissed airily as a survival from the Middle Ages, scarcely a reality of modern politics. Clearly, she thinks that's a mistake. They could never understand that more was at stake in the Dreyfus affair than mere social status, if only because more than mere social anti-Semitism had been brought to bear. You know, and this goes to what I said earlier, that she really didn't like Dreyfus, and she didn't like a lot of the Jews in the Dreyfus affair. And the two heroes that she elevates are neither of them Jews. It's Picard and Clemenceau. You know, now how do you react to that? You know, there's I think a simplistic, oh, she's clearly anti-Semite, or she's got a hidden, you know, anti-Semitism because she sees the heroes as not Jews. You know, I don't think that's right, but you know, I understand why people say it. You know, what she does embrace what she thinks as a political answer to the problem, the constitutional answer to the problem, right? That Rachel's question was about earlier. And what bothers her is that the Jews in the Dreyfus affair didn't make constitutional arguments. In fact, you know, she's very scathing or snide, however you want to put it, that Dreyfus's family was willing to try and do things like underhanded bribes and stuff to try and get him out, because they cared more about getting him out than they did about the law. And, you know, one could say, well, we should sympathize with them. We'll do anything to get our, you know, our family member out of Devil's Island. But she was, you know, Arendt has a kind of sometimes, you know, high level. She demands a lot of us, and her view was that you have to fight this on legal grounds, not on purely power grounds, because you have to develop a politics, and that's her argument. I can understand why you know, people criticize that. I think it's a very strong argument that she's making, strong in the sense of, you know, difficult to uphold. But I think you're on to something, and it's important.
It's just the reality of the choices that I don't think she gives enough evidence to in her writing. I just wish she would say, having said all this in criticism of these Jews, however she were to say it, where could they go? I mean, the idea of a state is still a nascent idea at this point. Every country has this kind of opportunity for Jew hatred. Countries that have no Jews are capable of Jew hatred. So it's a very live option in any place.
Well, I think she has two answers.
You're trying to live somewhere. Where do you live?
Well, I think she has two answers, Peter, right? One is live in France as a Republican, small r Republican, right? And embrace the Republican culture. Or become a Zionist, and this is Jerry's point, right? And aim to find another place to live. I think those are her two answers. Dina, it was good to see you at the conference.
Yes, thank you. It was good to see you too. I have a question about Arendt's concept of crystallization. So this idea to
Of what?
explain crystallization,
Crystallization.
this idea to explain totalitarianism as it emerges out of the disparate subterranean elements. And they come together and bring forth this new, never seen before model, if you want to call it that. So in the reading we had, there were, I think, 3 mentions of it. One is on page 45 that you had referenced, the bringing forth, brings into the open, that the Dreyfus affair brings into the open on page 45. And then on 55, she actually uses that word crystallization, saying where discrimination is not tied up with the Jewish issue only, it can become a crystallization point. And then on page 120 at the end, she refers to these subterranean forces of the 19th century that then sort of enter into their full import. I just want to understand this idea a little better. I mean, what does it mean for various elements to crystallize together into totalitarianism or into whatever? Is that, by what logic does that happen, if logic is the right word for it? Or is there no logic to it? Because we're dealing with a stream. And if so, how then can we think what we are doing as it's happening?
So,
Or can
Dina,
we only discover it looking backwards?
just I'm going to answer you, but the second reference you gave me was on page what? 60?
Sorry, 55.
That 55 or
Yes, I think it's sorry, 65. I'm sorry, 65.
so? But that's also not in this chapter. But okay.
No, it's not. But 120 is in this chapter,
Yeah.
and it brings the
Okay.
chapter.
So let me just say, I think you're conflating 2 different concepts here, or 2 different ideas. So, the 3 citations you give, right? The Dreyfus affair brings into the open. On 65, you said she uses the word crystallize. I can't find it, but where is it?
Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I miss. Oh, sorry, it is 55. It says in the middle of the page, where discrimination is not tied up with the Jewish issue alone, it can become a crystallization point.
Okay. For a political movement.
Yeah.
And then the last one
And
about
then 120.
a light of recorded history.
Yeah.
I'm in. Hey, hi.
Oh, Heather, can you mute your? Yeah. So let me say, I think these are, what she's talking about here is, let's look at the Dreyfus affair and see what we can learn from it, right? And then it brings certain things into the open, other elements of 19th century anti-Semitism, right? What elements does it bring out into the open, right? That it's against the state, that it's about a kind of discrimination, and thus this discrimination can become a crystallization point for a political movement that wants to solve all natural difficulties. And so bring out to the open is simply that in looking at the Dreyfus affair, we can learn stuff from it. There is this idea that Arendt writes about, right, which is that her argument is that her book, The Origin of Totalitarianism, doesn't give us an origin. It doesn't tell us here is the origin or here is the cause of totalitarianism. She says, rather what I do is I look at different elements that together crystallize into totalitarianism. And, one of the interesting, hard interpretive approaches to this book is that she never tells you what the elements of totalitarianism are. that crystallize into totalitarianism. In some of her notebooks, she lists some, and then in other places she lists other ones. I've written a couple of essays in which I've tried to sort of identify what I think are the main elements of totalitarianism. And it would include social discrimination against Jews, social anti-Semitism, and political anti-Semitism. It would include, and thus anti-Semitism in general, and racism. It would include the sort of decline of the nation state. It would include imperialism. It would include bureaucracy. All of these are parts of, are what she would call elements that somehow together crystallize into totalitarianism. Most of what she's talking about here is just, to what extent the Dreyfus Affair helps us see some of these elements.
My question is, though, to what extent what is Arendt doing? Is she describing the various elements and the Dreyfus Affair being the various elements coalescing under certain conditions?
So she's saying, look, I mean, Jerry asked this question of why is this chapter in the book, and there's more than one answer to that. The cynical answer is she did all this work on the Dreyfus Affair for 10 years and then realized that it didn't really fit with her argument about totalitarianism, but wanted to use it anyway. And so she thought it's an interesting account and it's helpful and it tells us some things, and so I'll put it in. And she does say in one of the prefaces, a lot that there hasn't been much written on anti-Semitism that's very good. She's done all this research. Some of it doesn't fit totally into the book, but she's going to put it in anyway because she wants to provide the research to other people. And so, one argument is that she's basically putting it in there because she thinks it's important inherently, but not so important for her argument about totalitarianism. That said, I think Jerry is right, and I tried to make this argument as well. There are ways in which she thinks that the Dreyfus Affair makes visible certain elements that, even though they're part of a French anti-Semitism which has wholesome limits and is not yet going to lead to totalitarianism, are a foregleam of what will come, and are thus important to see both as a distinction but also as a precursor. And those are, this idea of the Jew, the idea of a rejection of a republican tradition and the state, and the rise of the mob in its relation to the elite. Those would be the main foregleams that I think she's pointing us to in this chapter.
And if we lived at the time of the Dreyfus Affair, is that what we are limited to? Is that all we could be doing, is to describe what it is that is happening? Or are we only able to look backwards and see what has happened? That's something like this.
Well, I mean,
or can we see the crystallization as it is happening, or is it only something that we can?
Well, I think she thinks she's describing for you what happened, and I think she's giving you an insight into a certain form of anti-Semitism. I mean, one of the interesting takeaways of this 120-page book on anti-Semitism, which is what this is, we use the word anti-Semitism, and just like people say the Eskimos have many words for snow, we have one or two. How many different anti-Semitisms has she identified in this book, right? There's French anti-Semitism, there's Austrian anti-Semitism, there's German anti-Semitism, there's elite anti-Semitism, there's mob anti-Semitism, there's social anti-Semitism. There's all sorts of different anti-Semitic approaches that she describes here. And there's a kind of deep dive into like, well, let's think about both anti-Semitism, but also the different variants of it, and look at how and whether these varied to the kind of anti-Semitism that became so incredibly horrendously destructive in the 20th century. And her argument is that there are connections, there are foregleams, there are foretastes, there are things, but she's going to make the argument that something radically new enters the world with the rise of imperialism, and thus with a new form of anti-Semitism in the 20th century. And that's what's going to be the topic of the next book, the book on imperialism. I mean, I think Jerry has said this at times. I've certainly say it in all my classes on this book. The theoretically most important chapters of Origins of Totalitarianism are in the imperialism section. That doesn't mean that the anti-Semitism section or the totalitarianism section aren't important or aren't good. They're great. They're fantastic. But if you really want to understand what she's trying to say about the origins of totalitarianism, most of it's going to happen in the imperialism section. And that's what we'll start next week. But before we do, I want to give one last question. Chris, you have time for one last question.
Okay. I really struggle over Arendt's atomization of anti-Semitism, social versus political. I have no idea what she means by this, but what I'm thinking is that what's going on is that the roots of anti-Semitism are extremely deep, whether you consider them social or political. The Augustinian doctrine that the quote, the Jew is the slave of the Christian, was embedded into canon law. The Thomas Aquinas affirmed the legitimacy of holding the Jews in perpetual servitude for their crimes. Pope Innocent III was even more emphatic about Jews in relation to the Christian world, that we needed to be forced into the servitude of which they made themselves deserving when they raised their sacrilegious hands against him and committed the crime. The Second Crusade in 1146 wound up with more Jews being murdered in France and in the Middle East than Muslims. And so it percolates up. Granted, the German Nazi expulsion of anti-Semitism, institutionalizing it and exporting it into all of Europe, was profoundly different than the French. And I might add, my other problem with this is her amazing belief on page 55 that was already pointed out. There's the paragraph where she says that the crystallization is one of the most promising and dangerous paradoxes of the American Republic, that it dared to realize equality on the basis of the most unequal population in the world, physically and historically. It's the United States laws that found themselves in the Nuremberg laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese Exclusion Act, the 1924 closing of the door to Ashkenazi Jews and Southern Europeans because they were not Nordic. And so for me, this is what's percolating here. And it continues to percolate throughout history up until the time that she's talking about with the Dreyfus affair and beyond. And it's percolating now. And this is the part that drives me crazy. I love Arendt, don't get me wrong, but it's the atomization and the splitting up that I think becomes problematic. When you're talking about political anti-Semitism, what are you talking about? Are you talking about laws? Are you talking about customs? Are you talking about the intersection of custom and laws? What is she talking about? And this is the problem I'm having as I read through these chapters. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
No, I mean, I just so I know, I mean, were you with us for the conversation on chapter 2 on political anti-Semitism or not? So I know whether how much I should repeat or not.
I saw it. I went online and I saw it.
So, I mean, what she says about, so first of all, the long list you gave of sort of church-based anti-Semitism, right, is absolutely real and important. No denying that. She wouldn't deny that at all. She thinks that is a different look. She thinks that is fundamentally based in a hatred of a Jew as Jewish, right? As a theological doctrine. So there's a that we don't like Jews because they're Jewish. What she's arguing is that in the 19th century, a new kind of ideological anti-Semitism emerges that has very little to do with the Jew being a Jew, because it applies to people who are Jews but are not religious, and it often is actualized and activated in places where there are no Jews. It becomes both a social justification for societal discrimination and a political justification for an attack on the state and a pushing of particular interest-based agendas. So that doesn't mean that there isn't still, Jew hatred as Jews.
Roger, let me just intercede for a second. The business about a Jew being a Jew. Jews who were not quote unquote religious were also murdered under the edicts of the Justinian Code, under the Inquisition that spread for many decades. And so it's that kind of parceling that I find really problematic.
I understand that, but we're out of time, so I'm just gonna,
okay, I'm sorry.
I'm just gonna try and answer to the extent I can. Of course, yeah, you can find exceptions, you can find these things, but her argument is that the kind of anti-Semitism that emerged with the Nazis, right, was fundamentally different. And that it really came out of a different political approach than the kind of theological approaches that you're talking about. Obviously, we're not going to be able to understand it until you read the next 4 chapters or 5 chapters in the imperialism section, because that's where she's going to make the argument. We haven't gotten there yet. Secondly, you don't have to agree with it. But I think she's on to something very important. And we'll see if it makes sense. But she's only going to be developing it really now, starting with chapter 5 and in the next 5 chapters of the imperialism section. So it's a good thing to end with. It's a good thing for us to hold on to and think about as you continue to read Hannah Arendt on imperialism. Please do enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you next week to talk about the first chapter of imperialism. Thanks very much.
Perfecto. Gracias,
Thank
Professor
you.
Roger.
Ciao,
Thank you.
profe.
Ciao, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Great
you.
lecture, Roger. Great lecture.
See you.
By the way, great outfit, Professor Roger. Great looking.